In this video, we are going to look at cell junctions, or the connections that hold cells together to make up tissues. So we did briefly talk about cell junctions before, but we're going to talk about 5 specific ways that cells can connect together. So they are going to be gap junctions, tight junctions, adherence junctions, and then we're also going to have desmosomes and hemidesmosomes. And then the next few slides, we're going to go over each of these. Here is a really nice animation of the different types of intercellular junctions that you can look at. Just click on that link there. So tight junctions consist of these web-like strands of transmembrane proteins. So you can see they are here, these transmembrane proteins that fuse together the outer surfaces of these adjacent plasma membranes to seal off passageways between adjacent cells. So as you can see, these two plasma membranes are from adjacent cells. You're going to have cell 1 on this side, and then cell 2 is going to be on this side. Cells of epithelial tissue that line stomach, intestines, urinary bladder. These are examples of places that might have tight junctions. So stomach, intestines, bladder. So these are some places that you're going to find tight junctions connecting those cells together. Adherent junctions, they contain a plaque or a dense layer of proteins on the inside of the plasma membrane that attaches both to membrane proteins and also to microfilaments of the cytoskeleton. So here you have these microfilaments that run along and also these transmembrane glycoproteins. So adherence junctions help epithelial surfaces resist separation during lots of contractile activities. So this is like when food moves through the intestines. In epithelial cells, adherence junctions also often form these extensive zones called adhesion belts because they encircle the cell similar to how a belt encircles your waist. So you might have this cell that has a adhesion belt that actually goes the length around it, kind of like how a belt encircles your waist. Desmosomes contain plaque, just like adherence junctions, and they also have transmembrane glycoproteins that extend into the extracellular space between adjacent cells that attach cells to one another. So in those ways, they're very similar to adherence junctions. Unlike adherence junctions, though, the plaque of desmosomes doesn't attach to microfilaments, but instead it attaches to elements of the cytoskeleton known as intermediate filaments. And these consist of the protein keratin. These are kind of called spot weld junctions. And these are really common among the cells that make up the epidermis. Remember, the epidermis, we'll talk about it later, but the epidermis is going to be the outermost layer of the skin. And also very common among cardiac cells in the heart. So these types of connections prevent epidermal cells from separating under tension, And it also helps cardiac muscle cells from pulling apart during contraction. And they're kind of called spot weld connections as well, because it's just kind of this one little spot of plaque that attaches these cells together by these transmembrane proteins, instead of like the adherence junctions, which is a belt. So they're different in that way. Very similar to desmosomes, but hemidesmosomes don't connect adjacent cells together. They rather anchor cells to the basement membrane. And the basement membrane is a very thin, delicate membrane of protein fibers, separating the epithelium from underlying tissues. So this is going to be epithelium. And then below here, we're just going to have underlying tissues. So the basement membrane kind of separates those two types of tissues. These transmembrane glycoproteins in hemidesmosomes are actually going to be integrin instead of cadherins, as we saw in the other two. At gap junctions, membrane proteins called connexins form these tiny fluid-filled tunnels called connexons that connect neighboring cells. You have tiny ions and molecules can actually move through these connexons, but larger molecules can't. So small ions like sodium can actually travel through them, and this is really important in the normal operation of parts of the nervous system, contraction of the muscles of the heart, the GI tract, and the uterus as well. The transfer of nutrients and sometimes waste also takes place through gap junctions, and this occurs in avascular tissues. And avascular actually means no blood vessels, essentially. So normally blood vessels would remove waste and bring nutrients to tissues, but in areas where there are no blood vessels, like avascular tissues, such as the lens and the cornea of the eye, you have gap junctions that will play that role. Gap junctions also allow nerve or muscle impulses to spread very rapidly among cells, and this is a process that's very important in nerve conduction or impulse conduction in nerves as well. And we will go over that in more detail later. And that will be the end of part 2.